Hello, everyone. Let's give it maybe 1 more minute for everybody to join, and then we can start with today's session. Okay, let's start with today's session. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the Sustainability Omnibus and its global impact. I am your moderator. I'm Alice Grignani. I'm the EU Policy Specialist on Digital Defense and Internal Security at EU Issue Tracker. This webinar is hosted by our team at Fiscal Note, where we empower the world's leading organization with global policy insights and the tools to help our clients turn those critical insights into action. We will be recording this session and we will share it with you via email later this week. And we highly encourage you to submit your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Joining our conversation today are Fernando Juan López Cantó, the EU Policy Advisor on Financial Services, and Luke Salter, the EU Policy Researcher for Trade. Welcome both, and thank you for being here. To start, I'd like to invite each of you to please introduce yourself. Fernando, let's begin with you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alice. My name is Fernando Juan López Cantó. I'm the Policy Advisor for Financial Services. And in here, I cover everything from sustainable finance to investment law to the digital euro to the CSRD proposal that we'll be discussing later today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Fernando. Luke, please go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So, as mentioned, I'm the EU Policy Researcher for Trade, with my portfolio covering areas such as bilateral trade agreements, investment provisions, trade defense, and certain elements of customs.
Wonderful. Now, before we dive into today's discussion with our experts on the Sustainability Omnibus and its global impact, let me start with a brief overview of the Commission's broader simplification agenda, which has become a defining priority of the second von der Leyen's mandate. Against the backdrop of a global shift towards deregulation and building on the famous Draghi report, the Commission is committed to streamlining EU legislation in a way that boosts competitiveness and reduces administrative burdens while still upholding European standards, values, and innovation. To put this into practice, the Commission has introduced a series of omnibus packages, which are essentially bundles of measures that amend legislation across multiple sectors with the aim of making rules clearer, more targeted, and overall easier to implement. So far, over the course of 2025, we have seen already 6 omnibus packages being put forward, spanning from sustainability, investment, agriculture, business, defense, and chemicals. And we have additional packages already planned for the coming weeks and early next year, with one of them, the digital omnibus, already scheduled for tomorrow. Within the sustainability omnibus specifically, the simplification effort focuses on making due diligence and reporting rules more proportionate. For example, one of the key amendments to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD, is to narrow the scope of certain directives so they apply only to companies with a revenue of above 450 million euros. Similarly, revisions to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD, would amend the original directive so that companies are not required to seek information from business partners with fewer than 5,000 employees and would need to demonstrate additional efforts before terminating business relationships due to potential or actual adverse impacts. Overall, taken together, these measures aim to make EU rules more workable in practice, reducing unnecessary burdens, improving legal certainty, and ultimately enabling businesses to focus on sustainable growth while maintaining the EU high standards. Maybe focusing especially on sustainability, towards you, Fernando. With the simplification of sustainability requirements in the CSRD and the CSDDD, what would you say are the key policy-related challenges that need to be addressed?
Well, this is a very important question to consider. So I would say that the main issue that the co-legislators, the Council and the Parliament, have to really finalize in the discussion of the proposal is whether the climate transition plans under Article 22 of the CSDDD will be deleted or not. As it has already been announced, the Council's position was to have a weaker climate transition plan, but the Parliament backed last week to fully delete it. This is a key issue just because a lot of companies have already started drafting the climate transition plans. Even some have even gone as far as to begin implementing it, and this would cost quite a lot of resources for these companies. One point that I told a lot of clients would be a point of contention, but actually turned out that it will not be any major problem is the scope of both proposals, because the Parliament is proposing that the CSRD should only apply to companies above 1,750 employees with a net turnover above 450 million euros. And the Council did propose the same net turnover for 150 million euros, but that companies will need to have above 1,000 employees, so a bit of a change there. But for the CSDDD, both the Council and the Parliament agreed that the scope under which companies need to begin reporting under the CSDDD will be 5,000 employees and a net turnover of 1.5 billion euro. So these scopes are very similar and or the same in the case of the CSDDD, so this will actually not be a major point of discussion. And the other issues that we see now with the discussion on this proposal moving forward are a lot more minor, such as, for example, the Council's mandate for negotiations talks about maintaining a lot of the links to international climate treaties and a lot of language on how companies want to limit global warming, but the Parliament has deleted this fractions of the directive entirely. And the Parliament, for its side, has been allowing companies to use default values in cases that information on sustainability cannot be exported from third countries due to legal constraints implemented by those third countries. This is not a point actually discussed by the Council at all, but this is probably going to be something that they can agree on very easily. And it is very, very important for me to mention that actually trilogue negotiations have started just today. Actually, most likely they're taking place as we are hosting this webinar. And as I've mentioned, the position of both institutions is very similar, but it actually took a lot of political back and forth for the Parliament to get to this point in the legislative process. However, we believe that it might only take one round or two rounds of trilogue negotiations before a provisional agreement is reached between the co-legislators.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you also for the reminder of this nice overview of the proposal itself. Going back maybe to one of the last points you were making on the political back and forth that took place in the Parliament, could you maybe elaborate on which political issues have arisen from the proposed sustainability measures, particularly in the lead up to the trilogues that are starting today?
Of course, this is a very important issue. So we have seen a lot of political issues that have arisen from these sustainability measures, partially because, well, mostly actually, because the proposal was actually due to be finalized by the Parliament at the end of October, but that didn't happen. And the vote to approve the Parliament's report, the position of the Parliament before trilogues, was only agreed on last week on the 13th of November. And the main issue that happened is that the report that was approved was actually not approved by the centrist parties of the European Parliament, but it was adopted by the EPP, as well as the right-wing and far-right political groups of the Parliament. So what exactly happened? During the work in the committee's Parliament, the JURI Legal Affairs Committee, the EPP, SD, and Renew Europe political groups, their leadership managed to agree on a report which would have weakened both directives, the CSRD and the CSDDD, in comparison to the Commission's original proposal. And although this text was approved in the committee, it was actually not approved in plenary. This is allegedly because a relatively large number of S&D MEPs decided to vote against the report because the proposed sustainability norms were cutting a lot more requirements than they would have liked, the S&D MEPs. And what happened is that the plenary of the parliament had to vote again on its position and had to actually reopen the parliament. So what happened is that the rapporteur for the proposal, Jürgen Warborn, who hails from the Swedish EPP political group, ended up reaching an agreement with the ECR political group, so one of the members of the right wing, and this agreement was supported by both the PFE and TSM political groups. And this text that was agreed by the right wing and far right parties with APP was the text adopted in the parliament, which basically the main element to take out of this report is that an even larger number of companies would follow outside the scope of those directives. It would delete the need to present and to update the climate transition plans, and it would delete sector-specific responding and reporting standards. So if you have kept up with this topic, you might have seen online a lot of discourse as to whether the von der Leyen majority, which is the EPP, SND, Renew, and the Greens, their alliance for the current legislative cycle would hold. And we think it would, and that actually any fears that these groups will not be able to work together is, at least at this point, at least it's overblown, because we've actually seen all of these political parties working together relatively recently, just in the last month, actually. They agreed on the cell monitoring law and the 2040 EU climate target, which actually was the vote right before the CSRD and CSDD proposal in the parliament. So although in this case we do see that the von der Leyen coalition actually did not manage to cooperate in this, we have seen it happening in many other files recently, and also in this specific case for the CSRD and CSDD proposal, the rapporteur was very unwilling to compromise with the SND and Renew, having felt that he was cheated off by not adopting the report already in the jury committee. So that's why he also chose to engage with the right wing and far right. But of course, we'll still, since this happened very recently, we still need to see the impact that this vote will have on lawmaking for the EU's political parties.
Thank you. Building up specifically on this last point on political parties' perspectives, still for you, Fernando, have there been significant differences in how political parties in the parliament perceive and react to the simplification agenda? And maybe how might this difference affect the agenda's implementation?
So generally, all groups in the European Parliament, except for the left, have been supportive of the simplification agenda, and this is due to the fact that during the last legislative cycle, a lot of laws, a lot of regulations, a lot of directives were debated and approved, and this increased the cost of making business in the EU. And this is coming at a time when it begins to apply that actually the EU's economy is not particularly strong. So although the political groups actually do agree that some level of simplification is necessary, clearly the differentiation here is they cannot agree on how much simplification is too much and how much is actually necessary. So broadly speaking, the right wing and far right political groups in the parliament, so with this I'm referring to the ESN, PFE, and these are political groups, have generally called to fully scrap or severely weaken existing EU legislation. This was very clear because the PFE and ECR actually proposed at first to fully delete the CSRD and CSDD directives, and have generally called against expanding the Green Deal and actually to move away from it. In this case, we actually see that the EPP has been very split on what to do about the simplification norms. In general, what we're seeing with already the omnibus packages that have been proposed, as well as the CSRD, CSDD omnibus 1, that the EPP generally supports greatly weakening the scope of the text and to eliminate a large number of reporting requirements. However, the EPP is still very much split in some cases as to whether they need to delete them, as some EPP MEPs have called for, or not. Renew Europe has supported rationalizing and simplifying a key number of regulations, but actually have not gone as far along with the idea of eliminating this text as quite a lot of pundits had hoped for. They generally have been more supportive of simplifying key aspects of existing legislation. And even the SND and Greens EFA political groups have supported legislative simplification clearly at a much weaker scale, but they have generally supported excluding a larger number of companies from the scope of the directives that we're talking about today, the CSRD and the CSDDD. So on the set of implementation that you asked about, Alice, we do see that the Commission will, of course, they will implement this agenda. This is, of course, the main driver of the second from the line College of Commissioners, the simplification agenda. And the problem is actually that even if we have that they will implement the simplification agenda, the position of the EPP is more perilous than it seems, because although the EPP is projecting the sense of power, like, oh, we can decide what gets approved, what doesn't get approved, and they do have this power, the problem is that actually they're being forced to negotiate absolutely everything, that they cannot enforce their own opinion. So it just depends more on the MEPs individually, whether they want to support parties more on the right wing or parties more on the center and the left of the European Parliament. So that means that the EPP is constantly compromising. So their agreements in policy are not as strong as they would like. So this is a very major problem that for the simplification agenda, that actually the EPP, which is the party at the center of everything, will need to constantly compromise to bring any change into EU legislation.
Thank you. Following up on maybe this last point that you were making, and specifically on the relationship between sustainability and simplification, how do the simplification effort align with the EU's broader sustainability goals? And do you see any situation where these two objectives might conflict, Fernando?
So generally, we do not see a big point of contention between these two, because especially the CSRD and CSDDD directives, they aim to require a lot of sustainability information, a lot of reporting. This is, of course, both for investors, for companies themselves, and for competent authorities. The only issue that we see right now is, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar today, is whether the Parliament's position to delete the climate transition plans under Article 22 of the CSDDD will be adopted. Because if it is adopted, that means that companies will no longer be required to present plans on how they're going to become more sustainable, how they're going to attempt to comply with the 1.5 degrees to prevent higher than 1.5 degrees of global warming, as agreed under Paris Agreement. But if this is deleted, there is no way to show this, and there is no way to actually comply. So this is a case that both sustainability and simplification are at odds with each other.
Thank you, Fernando. Very interesting. Maybe moving on to a more international aspects and the more international implication of this. Luke, considering the EU simplification agenda, what are the potential impacts on the EU's external relations and trade policies? Do you foresee specific challenges in this context?
Thanks, Alicia. It's a good question. I'll try and keep my comments fairly brief, though, so that we can move on with plenty of time for Q&A. I think the fundamental story here, as it affects the EU's external relations, and a little bit about telling us, the EU's evolving place in the world, both perceived and actual, is that the EU is being pulled in two separate directions, both which are sometimes contradictory. So on the first side, the EU, in its relations with the rest of the world, is still very much the EU as we've come to know it, talking about market power Europe, the Brussels effect, right? Trying to use all of these things to bring global standards more into line with the EU's own historically and still fairly progressive legislation in a number of fields, climate being a key one. On the other hand, the EU internally, the overriding demand is to get the European economy moving again. And that's really what's driving the simplification agenda. However, what that's doing is it means that the EU is taking action which sometimes undermines its ability to use its own market power and its strength to try and bring the rest of the world into line. We saw this particularly in the run-up to the COP30 conference, where lots of people were talking about how, partially due to CSDDD, and the weakening of climate legislation in the EU as part of the simplification agenda, it was felt that the EU had ceded some of its global leadership in this regard. And so fundamentally, in the future, when the EU is going into these negotiations and trying to bring people into line with its own legislation, it's got a much weaker hand to do that because it's no longer seen as big of a global leader, and it's really ceded some ground there. It's also indicative of a degree of fragmentation within the EU, because the EU is still espousing the fact that it is, Europe which holds, democratic climate, all of these values as the cornerstones of how it legislates. But some of these are falling by the wayside due to economic concerns. And nobody's really come up with a way in which to reconcile these goals, and how to pursue its, economic, climate, trade goals at the same time without ceding too much ground on any of them and ceding too much ground on values. So I think that's really the big story here is of an EU which is, just due to the circumstances it finds itself in, being pulled in different directions.
Definitely. And of course, we have seen this and we are continuing to see this on a number of files, not just in the context of sustainability. Maybe keeping on the subject that we were following here. Look, what do you foresee could be potential pitfalls that the EU might encounter in its trade agenda as a result of the simplification measures?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, the first one is that it's weakened its hand and it's weakened its position as a global leader in these areas, to a certain extent. However, also we can see that the EU has, simply due to the number of bridges which the von der Leyen Commission is burning, and to put it no more strongly than this, the highly controversial nature of some of the measures it's taken, it's creating a situation where ratification of legislation is becoming increasingly political. There's a lot more horse trading involved. Increasingly, we're seeing an almost left-wing opposition group of, S&D, Renew sometimes when it suits them, Greens almost always these days, and the left forming, which are, even though oftentimes, particularly the S&D, can be talked around and find a compromise with the EPP, it's making life more difficult for the EPP. Trade legislation has historically been difficult to pass under any circumstance. And so the fact that, partially due to the simplification agenda, the Commission and the EPP are really making their lives more difficult is certainly going to be a pitfall. There's also the subsidiary factor of the EU-US agreement, which was not well received in many quarters outside the EPP. There's going to be increasing scrutiny of, all sustainability and trade measures now, about whether or not these are being introduced to, in some senses, appease the United States, which, again, that's just going to compound the difficulties that the EPP and the Commission has in forcing legislation through.
Thank you. You were just mentioning the EU-US agreement, focusing especially on the dynamics between these two blocs. How do you think that the Trump administration interest in revising EU internal legislation could influence the EU simplification effort? And do you think that this could create friction or instead opportunities for collaboration?
Thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting one because historically, one of the really big blocks in the EU-US trade relationship has been US opposition to, what is often perceived as EU overregulation of many fields. And so you would think, just going off that as a base assumption, that the EU simplification agenda would be bringing the United States and the EU closer together. However, what we're actually seeing is that that's not the case, largely due to the nature of the Trump administration. So part of it is that essentially, if I were to sum it up, this is too little simplification and in the wrong sectors. The the US under the Trump administration would ideally like to see the EU go even further with simplification and deregulation as far as its climate regulation. However, actually, the sectors which the Trump administration has really been talking about are not really climate legislation. The big ones they talk about a lot are agriculture, where they feel as though American agricultural goods are unfairly excluded from the European market, and digital regulation, where President Trump, the Trump administration, and some figures who support it within the US are not thrilled with the EU's digital legislation, to put it quite mildly. And so, those are really the areas where they're pushing for simplification. And so this really, it doesn't seem to be doing it for the Trump administration. So I suspect that simplification is not actually going to have a huge impact on the EU's relationship with the United States. I suspect that EU regulation will continue to cause friction there. And from the EU's perspective, in order to get an agreement that was acceptable to the Trump administration with the EU-US joint statement, um, they had to undertake to agreeing to things which have really not gone down well in Europe and have limited their room for further concessions. So I can't really see friction subsiding anytime soon.
Thank you. As we're getting ready to move into the Q&A session, and I would encourage all our audience today to submit their question in the box that they find at the bottom of their screen. Maybe I would ask you both, what are some key takeaways that you would like our audience to consider when thinking about the EU simplification agenda? Maybe let's start, Fernando, with you first.
Sure. If I was to take a single point out of this whole webinar, is that the simplification agenda, this is not a sprint. This is not even a 5 kilometer run. This is probably a marathon, now that they've become so popular. Because the simplification agenda will take many, many months, even with some of the measures that are shorter or that are simpler and that are already being discussed, such as this is triple D. This has already been 1 year almost a year that we're discussing it, and we're going to see a lot more simplification proposals and a lot more elements being proposed to simplify an increasingly large number of regulations and directives in the EU. So what I would say is there's going to be a lot of opportunities to be able to voice concerns, to propose legislation, and to have meetings to say these are the problems that we're encountering. So I would say yes, that this is not a sprint or a 5 kilometer run, but a marathon.
Thank you. Maybe Luke, if you have any input here as well.
Yeah, I think that Fernando covered it pretty well. The simplification agenda is not going anywhere anytime soon. This commission is going to be keeping going with it. And in tandem to that, what we're seeing launching off in the trade space is a desire to increase the number of bilateral trade agreements. There's a number, particularly with the ASEAN countries, that the EU has kicked off and aims to conclude negotiations of in the coming years, which, for most forms of legislation, that'll be pretty drawn out. For bilateral trade agreements, that's actually pretty ambitious. And so we're going to see that continuing in tandem. I think the biggest thing I would say is that the political dynamics are not going anywhere either, right? So whilst, of course, this is going to be a marathon in the sense that it's going to be drawn out, it's probably going to characterize the second von der Leyen Commission. It's also going to take longer to get legislation through.
Of course. Thank you. Maybe while we wait for some question to trail in, I would have maybe a couple more questions for both of you. Let's say maybe starting with Fernando first. What potential benefits could companies experience once the simplification measures are fully implemented? And do you think that there are specific areas where businesses might see reduced operational costs?
Absolutely. The whole pathos, the whole idea behind the simplification agenda is to lower the cost of doing business in Europe. The Commission knows that a lot of the more recent legislation has been quite expensive or quite difficult for businesses to implement. So any of the measures will for sure achieve some operational cost reduction. More specifically, talking about the CSRD and the CSDDD proposals, uh, even if the only element that was being debated was a reduction of the scope, would see that this would benefit a lot of companies, as a lot of companies would get out of having to report under both of these directives. And seeing the position of the Parliament and the Council, this means that even fewer companies will need to report under these two directives. And regardless, the proposal and the position of the co-legislators is to reduce the amount of information that needs to be reported, is to reduce the number of data points that need to be sent. So overall, yes, for businesses, this is a win. We will see reduced operational costs for business in Europe.
Thank you. Maybe Luke, if you have any input as well here.
Yeah, I mean, so the trade impact of this, I suspect, is going to be fairly marginal. But obviously, cutting down on the amount of regulation you need to deal with, the amount of paperwork you need to fill in, that's good for business. It's going to make it easier to invest in the EU market. It's going to make it easier to do business with it. So there probably will be an impact on trade flows, but the scale of them probably won't be quite the same as the impact on the internal market. The only area where I could have said that the simplification agenda is potentially bad for businesses is not related to the agenda itself so much as the political dynamics we're seeing it create. Because it's highly unlikely that any Commission proposal is now going to arrive at its final point unchanged. And so, whilst you can be pretty sure that some of the bones of the legislation that you first see proposed are going to reach there, exactly what you're going to need to wait and see. And so it's just going to mean that businesses need to pay a little bit more attention to what's happening in the policy space.
Thank you. Again, for the two of you here, what are the long-term implications of the simplification agenda for the EU policies landscape, and how might this shape future legislative initiatives? Here, maybe I would start first with you, Luke, instead.
Yeah, so I mean, returning to essentially where I started this with, this is fundamentally indicative of an EU which is being pulled in different directions. One long-term implication is the EU is going to have to square that circle eventually, um, and either return to a more traditional version of what we've seen from the EU, which seems pretty unlikely, or start bringing its ambitions for its external relations into line with what it's doing at home. Um, so that's point number one. I would have said the second point is, as I said previously, this is probably going to characterize the second von der Leyen Commission. And these political dynamics are not going to change. So we're going to see a lot more horse trading. It's probably going to take a lot longer to get legislation through. And there's going to be a lot more speculation and rumor and political groups making sort of grand gestures of saying, we will block this piece of legislation as essentially their opening bargaining gambit. Um, so yeah, fundamentally, we're just coming from a period where it was it was rare for legislation to go to second reading, let alone for there to be any possibility of it being shot down. And we're now moving into a space where that's very possible. The EPP cannot force things through on their own. And so they're going to have to do bridge building. They're going to have to do coalition building. And it's just going to make everything take a bit longer.
Thank you, Fernando. Do you also have any insight and input here?
Yeah, I can provide some input in here. A very interesting long-term implication that we're going to see, and actually we expect this to last not only until the end of the second von der Leyen College of Commissioners, but even further on, is the EU will actually be scared of proposing legislation, whether directives or regulation, that would actually increase the cost of doing business in the EU, because the simplification agenda is a matter of reducing costs, of making legislation more easier to implement, is to make legislation easier for businesses, is less costly. So the commission will actually be scared to propose anything that would feel as an increase in bureaucracy or red tape, because it would think, oh, but we have this agenda, the simplification agenda, we cannot propose anything that would add more difficulties to making business. And actually, if we hear any of the proposals that are coming out, such as the digital omnibus that Alicia mentioned earlier in our webinar, we're most likely going to see a big weakening of a lot of digital norms. Also talking about financial services that I'm more experienced in, we're going to see a package coming out in the 3rd of December that is likely going to change a lot of directives and a lot of regulations to make them a lot easier and to make sure that capital flows better between EU member states. So for sure, at least until the end of the von der Leyen second college of commissioners and even further, we would say that any legislation that would increase the cost of doing business in the EU will be a no-go already.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question from the audience, and I would say, Fernando, this is most specifically for you. How long should we expect for the omnibus package to be finalized, since you mentioned that this would be a marathon?
So the omnibus package, this is likely going to be finalized very, very quickly because this is such a political issue. The CSRD, CSDDD affects a lot of companies right now. A lot of companies have to report under both directives. Even very small companies would need to start reporting under the CSDDD after in the next few years. So specifically talking about the omnibus package, this will be actually probably this is going to be a bit closer to a half marathon than an actual marathon, to keep with the similes. But once the trilogues finish, and again, as I mentioned before, they're probably not going to have too many rounds of trilogues. I would say two at most. I would be surprised if they need to have 3 rounds of trilogues for this proposal. And they actually managed to finish it at the end of this year. What will still happen is that member states will have still 12 months to implement all of the changes to the directives into their national laws. So if we assume that they're going to finish the political discussions on the Omnibus 1 package towards December, and the finalized text is published in the OJ in the beginning of January, or in January generally, we're probably only going to see the changes becoming full law in the EU member states by the beginning of next year. So that would be this, but the actual part, that is the half marathon, is already halfway to completion, as trilogues have already started and both the position of the Parliament and the Council have been already settled. But my point about the marathon was not only about the omnibus proposal, but about the simplification agenda more generally, that the simplification agenda will be the actual marathon, where a lot of different proposals, a lot of different legislations are going to be tabled and debated, and that's where companies need to make their voices heard, so that because this will be a lot of changes, and the EU will not be able to work as fast with some proposals as it has been working with the Omnibus 1 package. Omnibus.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions for the moment. So I would say that wait, let's see if there is, actually, yes, we have one last question coming in. This more for you, Luke, instead. Regarding trade on the EUDR's proposals, if I import, for example, a palm-based ingredient and I turn it into a surfactant in an EU country, while a competitor does the same procedure but outside Europe and then sells the product in the EU, can the competitor claim their product is deforestation-free?
Yeah, okay, so that's quite a specific question. So what I'd have said is that if you don't mind, leave that question with us and we can get you a written response after the webinar.
Thank you, Luke. This has been a really insightful conversation, but unfortunately for today, we're out of time. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for their time and the willingness to share, and to you all in the audience for joining us today. And for any other question, if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them through our emails channels. So
thank you very much for everyone to attend, and I want to thank especially Alice for moderating and look for the great conversation that we had.
Yeah, I mean, thank you all for attending. You know, the webinar couldn't have happened without you. Obviously, you as well, Alice. Couldn't have happened without the moderator. And thank you for Fernando for the great conversation.
thank you again to you both. And to learn more about FiscalNote and our family of brands, visit fiscalnote.com and follow us on social media, and have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you again.